Alrighty, ladies, gentlemen, poorly educated communist sympathizers, welcome back to Cut Rate History, where we are doing a series on American history. Before we jump into it today, I'm going to address a couple things that came up in the last few videos. Some people not a fan of how I don't write scripts for these videos. Going to address that because a lot of history channels do write scripts, and a lot of those channels are very good. I've brought up the Fat Electrician a million times, and I'm going to continue to do it a million more because he's one of my favorites. However, if I personally wrote a script for these videos, I think it would come off as if I were just reading to you an essay. And if that's how I wanted this channel to come across, I would just post an essay on the internet and then you guys could go and read it. Boring, we've all been there. School sucks. This is supposed to be kind of a more enjoyable way to digest what is ultimately sometimes very boring content. So I'm not going to do that. Sorry for you. If you don't like it, you don't have to subscribe or watch these videos. Um, Other than that, I think that's it. Let's get after it. Today we're going to talk about the interwar period. We're going to talk about the interwar period specifically in the context of the United States home front. We're not going to talk about global politics, European politics, what's going on everywhere. We're just going to talk about what is going on in the U.S. Between the end of the First World War and arguably the beginning of the Second World War, depending on your definition. Let's get after. Oh, and I also a little bit under the weather. Apologize. I probably sound a little stuffy, but we'll get through it. But let's get after it. The war's impact on the economy was huge. Even before the U.S. entered the First World War, excuse me, we were still making stuff for basically everybody. Like we're going to see in the Second World War, the U.S. had arguably the largest logistical and manufacturing economy that was not at the time being affected by the war. Our factories weren't getting bombed and sabotaged and blown up. So, logically, this is where a lot of the belligerent powers were getting their stuff. And making this stuff for everybody made the American economy expand. And after the war, when there wasn't so much of a demand for this stuff, the economy didn't adjust quickly, and that caused inflation. In the first couple of years after the end of World War I, inflation rose about 15%, and the economy was looking at a recession in the late teens and very, very early 20s. This inflation is going to lead to some strikes. It was really hard to find good photos of this. We're going to talk about strike breakers later. But if you look at this picture, this is actually the National Guard responding to some strikes. And the government is actually going to be some of the first strike breakers. However, the definition of a strike is there. I'm not going to read it to you. You're an adult. You know what it is. Some examples. The Seattle General Strike was 60,000 people, lasted 5 days. The Boston Police Force strike, 75% of the force walked off the job, and they were later fired. This led to a massive increase in crime in Boston and the greater surrounding area for a non-trivial amount of time. Steel workers, 350,000 of them went on strike, lasted several months. Collectively, all of these people, all of these strikers wanted the things that stereotypically they want. This is where the stereotype comes from. So, better hours, better pay, and they wanted unions to be recognized. The U.S. government is not going to be a big fan of unions. We'll talk about why in the next couple of slides. But long story short, very early on, they're seen as communists. They're seen as socialist, and that kind of thing is untrustworthy and un-American. at this time. The other thought is big business, not a fan. They want the government to get involved to break up these strikes because this is causing big business to lose money. Guys like Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, um, Andrew Carnegie, guys like that are going to want, are, which is ironic, they're going to want government regulation on unions and strikes because it's causing them to lose money. Um, yeah, so we'll leave it there and we'll talk more about it as we give more examples. One of the most famous things that leads to more regulation actually happens right before the First World War, and a bunch of the regulation takes place afterwards. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. Happens in 1911. Very long story short, a shirtwaist was a type of blouse. It was a type of garment at the time. This factory made those almost exclusively in very high numbers out of very flammable materials, mostly cotton. Buildings in New York City, in the upper floors of the Triangle factory. 8th, 9th, and 10th floors, if I remember correctly. It should be on screen for you right here. 180 people are working in there in 1911. March, building catches fire. And the building had every possible thing either go wrong or be neglected that led to the deaths of lots of people, almost a vast majority of people inside. There were stairway doors that opened inward, so people who crowded the doors getting away from the flames, they couldn't open the doors because they opened towards the people. The people were crowding the doors. Fire hoses were not connected or rotted away, and the pipelines weren't inspected. They couldn't do anything. They couldn't hold the water pressure. There was a fire escape that didn't reach the street. There was fire escapes had been bricked up because the owners didn't want the workers smoking in the stairwells. It led to a bunch of people having to take the elevators down. The elevators started to fail. People died in the elevators. People had to jump down the elevator shafts. People started jumping out of the windows, which led to the fire department putting up nets to catch the people, but there were so many people jumping at one time that they broke through the nets. It was awful. It was absolutely terrible. And this is kind of the inciting incident that inspires the reform that all of the strikes we talked about in the last slide are going to be pushing for post World War I. This coincides, it doesn't directly cause, but certainly coincides with the Red Scare, the first Red Scare. So all the strikes that are happening that we talked about with the steelworkers and the Boston police are happening roughly late 1918 and then in 1919. And it causes a lot of people who are not directly connected to those strikes, but who are hearing about it, on the radio, through the newspapers. Leads a lot of regular, for lack of a better word, Americans to believe that communists are conspiring to start a revolution in the U.S. because all of these unions, again, remember, they're seen as socialists. And with a former ally, Russia, dropping out of World War I, creating their own treaty with Germany, a lot of American citizens felt betrayed. Russia, at this point in time, was a friend, an ally. They were helping us defeat the bad guys. And when they dropped out, a lot of people genuinely felt betrayed. And because of that, because of their revolution towards communism, it leads communism to be associated with that betrayal and almost like a deceit, like it was some big master plan for them to enter the war and pretend to be our friends and then drop out and turn communist. No, that's obviously not true. However, it doesn't change the fact that a lot of Americans still felt that way. And socialist sentiments have been creeping up for the past couple of decades. We talked about Karl Marx in a video a couple of videos ago, depending on when I decided that was posted. Anyways, we've talked about Karl Marx. Those types of ideas had been coming around since the late 1800s. And it started in Europe. And we talked about before, there's a lot of European immigration at this time. In at with with the communists or socialist Marxist stuff circulating Europe, and then Europeans coming here, a lot of immigrants were accused of bringing those socialist and eventually communist ideals to America, and then a lot of immigrants get blamed for the unions, the strikes, the labor unrest, all that stuff. Under all of this paranoia, there is a legitimate communist threat in the U.S. in the late 19 teens. April 1919, the U.S. Postal Service intercepts more than 30 packages that had IEDs with them. They were homemade bombs, and they were addressed to prominent Americans. So some of them were politicians, some of them were businessmen, some, things like that. People who were in the public eye in the late 19 teens. 1 month later, a bunch of socialists, communists, Marxists, sympathizers, people who had that way of thinking, they get together, they organize a parade to protest the jailing of a guy named Eugene Debs. He was their political leader. Like the birth of the Communist Party in the U.S. is Eugene Debs. Like so many other things on this channel, is it more complicated than that? Yes, but big picture, that's kind of what's going on. Now, these protests, like a lot of recent history, ironically, evolve into violence. They evolve into riots. These particular riots, 2 people lose their lives, another 40-ish are injured. The local police did not have the people or the supplies to put down this riot, and National Guard units had to be deployed to put the riot down. The following month, in June of 1919, 8 more bombs. These ones do detonate. And it's 8 bombs in 8 separate cities. They're major cities, so it's New York, Chicago, LA, things like that. And all of them explode within minutes of each other. It was very well organized, and kind of rightly so, led a lot of Americans to believe that there was a nationwide conspiracy to do a lot of things, but like largely just like overthrow the American way of life. Either way, like this is actual proof that there was a nationwide group of people who were claiming to be communist and claiming responsibility for actual terrorist attacks. Moving away from that kind of stuff for a minute, regular kind of culture-y things. What's going on? The Great Migration is kind of at its peak in the late teens and very early 20s. A lot of African Americans begin moving from the South up to larger cities in the North, industrial cities. Kind of the ones that we just talked about, but also places, Boston, Springfield, Hartford, places like that. All of this collectively is known as the Great Migration, and this begins because there's a lot of hope to find better economic opportunities in the North, because there are simply more jobs to be had in the North, and also to escape the segregation in the South. In this time period, race relations are getting better. However, things definitely weren't great, especially in the South. The North was better than the South, objectively, empirically. However, it still wasn't great. Racism was absolutely still the norm in the North. I don't want people to think like there's definitely this misconception that like escaping to the North, during you know pre-Civil War was absolute freedom. It wasn't, and it definitely wasn't during Jim Crow either. Now, New York City's kind of like sub neighborhood, Harlem, was a massively popular spot for African Americans to settle at this time. Certainly the most famous. And it is here that a lot of that culture develops and grows into what we think of today. So this is the beginnings of the Harlem Renaissance. So nightclubs, music, art, political organization, pride organization, an absolute explosion of African American culture. It crosses racial boundaries, it bleeds into white culture. This is where jazz becomes not only a mainstream thing, but bleeds into white culture. This is the beginnings of what will be rock and roll. It all starts right here in Harlem, and it's all due to the Great Migration. And this cultural explosion is known as the Harlem Renaissance. Back to politics, prohibition. If you remember several episodes ago, we talked about a bunch of movements that were happening in the 1800s. One of them was the temperance movement. A lot of people were in favor of it, especially women. Women were in favor of the temperance movement because there was a non trivial amount of men who were alcoholics, and they were abusive alcoholics. With the passing of the 18th Amendment in 1920, um, or excuse me, with I'm getting ahead of myself. With the passing of women's suffrage in 1920, adding that new demographic of voters that allows the 18th Amendment to be passed, and which is basically what passes prohibition. You're thinking that's an odd timeline of things to happen. Remember, women largely had the right to vote in the Midwest and the West far before they got the right to vote nationwide. Remember, this was one of like the bargaining chips that a lot of territories used to get people to move there to get the in order to achieve the minimum population to apply for statehood. Keep that in mind. Like I said, it is just an odd timeline of things to happen, but this is what's going on. A lot of people supported temperance and prohibition for different movements, for different reasons. Religious grounds, drunken unemployment was a big thing, but the largest driving factor was domestic violence and poverty, which is what that demographic of women adding to the voting population ultimately pushed over. There's immediately pushback. Anytime there's giant governmental regulation, there's always pushback. There's legal and illegal. We're going to start with the legal stuff. So basically, overnight, a bunch of businesses, previously bars, um, did not have the legal right to sell what they were selling the previous day. So, in order to adapt, a lot of saloons and bars immediately take to ice cream. Ice cream is going to fill the social void that alcohol had filled previously. And a lot of we'll talk about the illegal pushback here in a second, and whether or not it was entirely ice cream or just only officially ice cream. A lot of these bars turned into ice cream parlors and, to a lesser degree, soda shops. And for a massive generation of people, ice cream, like I said, is fills this social void. It becomes overwhelmingly popular. And for People like me who were born in the 90s, my grandparents and my great grandparents always, always had ice cream in the house. It starts here because it is ingrained in them as such a social norm, kind of the way that alcohol was previously and sort of is now. Um, Aside from that, there is political pushback. There's lots of lobbying, protesting. It will eventually give way to change. The 21st Amendment in 1933 does repeal the 18th Amendment and ends prohibition. That is like the official above board reasoning for it happening. There was genuine lobbying and protesting, which did help. However, it was a lot of the illegal pushback to prohibition that led to the 1933 repeal. Secret bars, they were called speakeasies, get opened to fill this void. There is never not a desire for alcohol. It's almost undeniably human nature. So there are underground uh, bars. They're hidden. They're, fronted as ice cream parlors. They're in people's basements. They're all kinds of things. However, how are we going to get alcohol if it's illegal to make it? People start bootlegging. They make their own alcohol. So sometimes it's done by, taking industrial alcohol, distilling it down, or making it out of like genuine, like moonshine, mash, stuff like that. What this leads to is the government mandating all manufacturers of that industrial alcohol to use methyl alcohol. That is poisonous, and not everybody is aware of this government mandate, so they're still using industrial alcohol to make um, ingestible alcohol, and this causes the death of over 10,000 people. There's also a lot of unofficial conspiracies that arguably can be proved if you look at the right things of the government straight up poisoning alcohol and killing people that way. Anyways, look it up. I won't make a decision either way. What this does bring to the table is organized crime. This is the explosion of organized crime in American culture that is associated with the mob and the mafia, things like that. It starts with the illegal, illicit alcohol trade. So they start smuggling booze in from Canada, the Caribbean, Mexico, all over the place. And, the mob starts getting cops on the payroll to allow this stuff to come in. All of the stereotypical stuff that you've heard before. It really starts here. Couple of cool facts. During this time period, Al Capone rises to prominence. And it's Al Capone that is the reason we have expiration dates on groceries. The story goes his niece got super, super sick ingesting, I think it was like expired milk. And he went on this absolute tirade of, you guys need to shape this up. He puts a bunch of money and people into it, into this project to come up with expiration dates and how to let people know when roughly something is going to go bad so they don't drink it and get sick. Cool fact number two, NASCAR has its roots in Prohibition. All of these mobsters or people involved in the trade, they got to run this moonshine, they got to run this alcohol, they got to get it to the speakeasies. They often find themselves in car chases with the police. And so they soup up their cars, they modify their cars to make them faster so they can outrun the cops. Well, 1933, it happens and Prohibition is no longer, and now a bunch of guys are left with these super fast cars for the time. What are we going to do with them? Naturally, we got to race them. And that is where NASCAR comes from. Prohibition and guys and having fast cars, and no longer having to outrun the cops. What are we going to do with these fast cars? We're going to put them on a racetrack. This leads into the Roaring Twenties, um, with the government kind of cracking down on all of the strikes and the unions. That stuff slips away quietly, and the American economy starts to recover, and it recovers really fast, and it starts growing. Wealth is spreading. There's a new system in place. Well, there's two really. One is the credit system. This idea of spending, using, having money that you don't actually have, and also these people using that new credit system in this thing called the stock market. Leads to a massive amount of economic growth. If you're any sort of a scholar, I'm sure you know where this is going, but before we get there, there's a bunch of other stuff we got to talk about. Women in this time period, the term flapper gets thrown around a lot. It's a female who in the 20s rejects the traditional gender roles. They cut their hair short. They dress scandalously. For the time, it's really not scandalously for today, but for the time, it was a big deal. They drank publicly. They did all of the things that men have been doing for centuries. The bootlegging and alcohol trade combined with the speakeasies um, brings people together. The thing that brings people together the most is a common enemy. The Revenue Bureau, which is the precursor to the IRS, is hated and despised by the vast majority of people. When you watch movies or read literature about this time, revenue agents are hated by anybody who was taking part in the Roaring Twenties. If you are a regular old person, probably didn't really matter to you. But if you were, think Jay Gatsby, you know, bit of a hyperbolic example, but think that kind of person. People who were in, uh, they were not fans of the pre-IRS. The KKK comes back. Probably didn't see that one coming. And it's this KKK that most people have in their minds when they think of the KKK. We have talked about them before. We talked about their founding with the closing of the Civil War during Reconstruction. They kind of go away for a long time. They come back in the 20s and 30s. Because the U.S. is expanding so much, the economy is doing so well, it becomes very appealing to immigrants. The influx of these immigrants doesn't sit well with some Americans, and they felt they should do something about it. Sure. So the KKK returns, but it's different. It's no longer just, you know, non-official wing of the Democrat Party. Excuse me. It's no longer just in the South. It's everywhere. It expands to the north, and it targets way more people than it did the first time around. So yes, African Americans are absolutely targeted, but it expands to Catholics, Jews, the vast majority of immigrants. Basically, if you were not a white Protestant, and white meaning um, far more restrictive than what is considered white today, like white from England, Scotland, Ireland, the Nordic countries, places like that. You know, Italians were not considered white. Um, Polish people were not considered white. Um, so keep that in mind as we talk about this. As we move forward, they will come up again, unfortunately. Um, by 1924, they had more than 4 million members in the U.S., And this is the time period where they adopt the quote Confederate flag. Um, the Confederate flag is the Mississippi battle flag that was used during the American Civil War. They take it and turn it into this. This is where it gets the connotation of the KKK and racism. Before this, it didn't have that connotation. It was a battle flag. It was a military flag. It wasn't used that way. An argument to be had for another time, another video. But just know that this is when they adopt it. This is when it gets that connotation. This is when it gets associated with racism and all of the terrible things. The Scopes Monkey Trial. This is a weird time period where kind of the South and the Midwest are culturally kind of moving away from the Northeast. The the Roaring Twenties that we just talked about is an East Coast Northeast kind of phenomenon. What's going on in the South and Midwest is an expansion of more conservative views. Long story short, there's this guy, he's a school teacher, and he's teaching evolution to his students. And gets found out by the parents. The parents are upset because they don't believe in evolution. They're what we would today call like fundamentalist Christians. So they're mad. They sue this guy. He gets put on trial, and he loses. The Scopes Monkey trial ends in the government saying the school system does not have the right to teach evolution, which is, only a theory. It can't be proven. It's not a fact. We shouldn't be teaching these things. It disagrees with the Bible and all and these values, XYZ. What this embodies is, like I said a second ago, this area of the country is developing I have a different set of laws, I think, written on the on the slide, which is ultimately true. It wasn't illegal to teach evolution in the Northeast or the East Coast. However, it's more than that. It's a different culture, and this is where we see a big separation in North and South culture, yes, but also a Western culture is developing, kind of out of the post Reconstruction era settling in the West. It's kind of coming to fruition now. The stock market crash. I'm sure a lot of you thought of this as soon as I mentioned the Roaring Twenties and the stock market at the same time. There were a couple of incidents. There was a Black Tuesday, there was a Black Friday, there was a Black Thursday. The largest one was Black Tuesday. It was October 29th, 1929. The stock market crashes and loses $15 billion in value. This is the biggest one. There are more. I understand that. But to keep it fairly simple, we're, again, big overview. We'll go back and talk about more later. Within 2 weeks of Black Tuesday, the value of the stock market had lost a total of $30 billion. People lost everything, not just wages and jobs, but homes, cars, everything. They defaulted on bank loans, they defaulted on their mortgages, everything. They had to withdraw their savings. A lot of the time it wasn't enough. And with people pulling all of their savings out of the banks couldn't recover from the losses. They started to default on stuff. The banks closed. It was a runoff. If you've seen It's a Wonderful Life, that's what they were worried about in that movie. This starts the Great Depression. And it spans from 1929 through 1940-ish can be argued when we got out of it, but we got out of it because of World War II and the production that we were doing for that. The Great Depression as a whole, like I said, people lost everything. Living day to day was a massive task. People were starving and freezing. It was terrible. As people lost their homes, people began to make like makeshift tent cities, shanty towns, and they were called Hoovervilles after President Hoover, who a lot of people blamed for the Great Depression itself. One big thing I want to talk about is the bonus army. So, in World War One, veterans were promised a bonus that was paid to them. I forget, I want to say like 20 or 30 years after they got out of the military. And it was promised to them because of their service in World War One. And now things are so dire, a lot of these veterans go to the government and they ask for their bonuses early because they have nothing and they just risked their lives not too long ago for the world and for their country. The government says no, so 10,000 of these guys, these are World War I veterans, they march on Washington, D.C. to collect that bonus payment, to collect that money. They had promised to pay them over, like I said, the next 10 or 20 years or something like that. To meet them, the government sent out the army. The army met these 10,000 veterans, and when these veterans refused to disperse, the army, our U.S. government, opened fire on them with cannons and put an end to the bonus army march. So keep that in mind when people say, oh, the government would never do that. They've been doing it for literally 100 years. Anyways, Roosevelt's New Deal gets talked about today or referenced today in the Green New Deal that was proposed a few years ago. This is where they got that phrasing. The original New Deal. A lot of times, I'm going to throw it out there right now. A lot of times, Roosevelt is credited with ending the Depression because he did all of the things I'm about to talk about. Really, the people who credit him with this only credit him with that achievement because he happened to be president when the Depression ended. However, it was not, I am telling you right now, it was not his policies that put an end to the Great Depression. What put an end to the Great Depression was the increased manufacturing demand that World War II started and that we had not entered yet. It was that creation of more jobs and expansion of business that pulled us out of World War II, or pulled us out of the Great Depression at the beginning of World War II. However, what he did is still important. We're still going to talk about it. I just want to throw that out there before we even get into it. The New Deal is a general term used for the stuff that FDR implemented during the Depression. He wanted to restore faith in the government. Nobody had faith in the government. Remember, they were calling their shanty towns Hoovervilles. The army had just shot at American veterans. Nobody had faith in the government. And FDR wanted to restore that. So he passes a bunch of bills. He buys out mortgages for farms and houses, and he bails out banks and then begins regulating them. Prior to this, there was no federal regulation on banks. So he starts federal regulation on banks, and he starts providing jobs for those in need. He does all kinds of stuff. He does stuff that was considered at the time and could be argued today that is socialist. He just gave people jobs, which sounds like a good thing, but some of the jobs were erroneous, to say the least. I remember reading about one that was a dog counter. Not a dog catcher, not somebody who went out and caught stray dogs for the city. The job was to go out around town and walk around and count the stray dogs. Full stop. And they would get paid for that. And a lot of people saw that as a good thing because you were going out, you were doing something, and you were getting paid for it. A lot of Americans had a really hard time just taking bailout money. It was not like today. Um, People had a really hard time accepting money for not providing something in return. A movie that shows this excellently. It shows the Great Depression as a whole fantastically, actually. Is Cinderella Man with Russell Crowe. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. It's a fantastic movie. I used to show it when I was teaching. Anyways, in addition to regulating the banks, providing jobs for a lot of people, it's FDR's administration that creates and puts in place Social Security to help the elderly and unemployed. Starts off as unemployed. This is like the unemployment office, and then grows into the elderly because they're one of the groups of people that, despite maybe wanting to work for the government or for the government money that they're getting, they can't because they're elderly. However, despite all of the stuff and Roosevelt does more than this, the New Deal is more than this. These are just kind of the highlights. But despite all this stuff, most Americans were still egregiously poor. And like I said, what's going to pull us out of the Great Depression is World War II and the manufacturing demand that creates. The Dust Bowl happens during the Great Depression, and what little people had in the Midwest, a lot of them lose even more. The Dust Bowl is a culmination of several massive dust storms that destroy countless houses, farms, cities. Um, in this time period, there was a lot of over farming without proper reseeding. People weren't they weren't giving fields a break. There was no rotation field. There was no planting of soybeans to bring back nitrates, stuff like that, because they couldn't afford it. They needed all of the production they could. And what this led to is really, really poor and sandy soil. This combined with a drought caused all of these dust storms. And it is FDR's policies that help recover from this tragedy, because what his New Deal does is they provide food, water, and eventually wages for migrating farmers, people who up and left the places that were affected by the Dust Bowl. They relocate, and it's FDR's policies that kind of get them back up on their feet. And like the banks before them, it's FDR's administration that begins regulating farming. They put rules in place so this doesn't happen again. Basically, mandating field rotation, the planting of certain crops at certain times to reinvigorate the soil with certain nutrients, that kind of thing. And it's this incident combined with FDR's policies that take the farmers from arguably one of the most vulnerable groups in society to one of the most protected, which is great because that's how we eat. It's kind of how it should be. Um, Farmers are the backbone of America and most countries. That's the end of what we're going to talk about today. Like what we talked about before, I know that you can't click on this link. It's just here for me to remind myself to put it in the description, and I will do it there. You can go play Jeopardy on Jeopardy Labs. It's fun. I used to use it to help my students study, things like that. But that's where we're going to wrap it up for today. That's kind of what's going on in the years between the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II. The next episode, we're going to talk about what's going on overseas. Kind of the rise of the political leaders that lead to World War II, the political scenarios that set those people up, things like that. And I think that's it. If you made it this far, I appreciate you coming out. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll catch you in the next one.